President Obama, he's asked a question at a press conference. He knew that he struggled to be concise in those moments. He didn't want to just answer the question and give a soundbite to the media. He wanted to help unpack the problem. And so he might sort of, say, well, let's go back to the beginning and how this all started, and after Reconstruction in the United States, after the Civil War, he knew that we were behind the scenes sort of banging our heads into the desk saying, no, stop, don't go back to Reconstruction.
If you're looking for a good story, Terry Szuplat has plenty. As a foreign policy speechwriter for President Barack Obama, he spent 2 terms in the White House and abroad, narrowly dodging PR catastrophes, getting help from the locals, and as he put it, losing years off his life when the president wanted last-minute changes. Aside from his speechwriting, he's a really sharp political observer and just a treasure of a human being. And he's here to discuss his new book, Say It Well. Please enjoy after a word from our sponsors. The presenting sponsor for Socially Democratic is Dunn Street. Dunn Street is a campaign agency that specialises in community organising. We only work with people who want to build power to make the world a better place. And if you want to create change in 2025, then hit us up at dunnstreet.com.au. A special shout out to all of our Patreon members as well. And you can join our community for free or for as little as $1.50 a month. And you too can help support this podcast. All paid members receive a welcome gift. So if you have recently signed up, please check your inbox for a message from our producer asking for your shipping address, because without that, then we can't send you your merch. And finally, today's episode is brought to you by Maurice Blackburn Lawyers. Maurice Blackburn has been fighting for workers' rights in Australia for more than 100 years. They believe the law should serve everyone and not just those that can afford it. So for empathetic and expert legal support, call Maurice Blackburn Lawyers today. All right, let's get on with today's episode. We are taping this one on the lands of the Wurundjeri people on a Friday morning. And actually, this actually is my first episode of the year. The other ones that have already gone up this year, we pre-recorded. So mentally for me, this feels like episode number 1 for 2025. And what a great way to start this year's season of Social Democratic with one of my favourite guests. He's been on the show before, and I do highly recommend you go and have a listen to the first episode, because in that episode, we talked more about his sort of backstory. We're going to be a bit more contemporaneous with our conversation today. Terry Szuplat is a prolific writer, speaker, and trainer whose career in politics and public speaking spans over 30 years, including 8 years as a speechwriter for a bloke called President Barack Obama. Some of you may have heard of him. He's just written a book called Say It Well, Find Your Voice, Speak Your Mind, Inspire an Audience. It spent several weeks as a national bestseller in the United States and has been translated into 8 languages and is published in over 50 countries, and that includes this great nation of ours, Australia. And we'll be giving away a couple of copies at the end of the show. Terry, congratulations, first of all, on the book, and thanks so much for your time today.
Thank you. Thanks for having me back. I'm excited for this.
Now, as I said before, you've spoken on the show previously, and it's episode 160, I think it was, where we sort of talked a bit about your role as a speechwriter for Obama. So we probably will cover some old territory as well, but I am interested in getting a bit of a sense of sort of your inspiration for writing this book. But it would be remiss of me to not sort of talk about some tragic news coming out of your home city in Washington, D.C. Overnight, which was this aircraft collision between a commercial airliner and a Black Hawk. Just want to get a sense from you about how folks are feeling in Washington, D.C. right now.
Yeah, I think people are trying to process. I mean, nothing like this has happened in the U.S. In almost 20 years. I think it was 2009 since we lost a commercial airliner. And I'm actually in Arlington, Virginia, right across the river from DC. So National Airport is in Arlington. This is just a few miles from here. It's we haven't found out who was on the plane yet, so everyone's sort of bracing for that. When something like this happens in your own hometown, it's terrifying. And they shut down the airport and they finally reopened it, but it's still a disaster scene.
I've flown into that airport on a number of occasions for work and whatnot. It's actually quite a spectacular view of the city when you first head in there, but it's just it boggles my mind how this has actually happened. And then overnight, sort of waking up and looking at Twitter or X or whatever the hell we call it these days, and just seeing the lack of leadership shown by the president in this moment of need. Like it's like, oh, I forgot about how bad he is when. I guess I would call it when uncertainty happens and he has to react. I
Yeah.
find that his leadership just goes complete. Like it's COVID all over again with these just ridiculous conspiracy theories that he's just throwing out.
Yeah, I probably need a psychologist to figure this one out. But I haven't seen the video or of his press conference today. From what I understand, he came out and he delivered a very somber set of remarks that were trying to unify the country and bring the country together. Which would have been the appropriate language, and he was reading it, clearly written by someone and reading it, and then immediately, reverted to his normal conspiratorial, accusatory. Uh, throwing out all sorts of accusations against the previous administrations with absolutely no bearing in fact or reality. So, I mean, again, I think I'll leave it to a psychiatrist to figure out what's going on. But once again, not what we need. One of the things that I teach speech writing at American University here in Washington, and we have a whole class on crisis communications. And one of the first lessons that I teach these young students who are about to go out into the world is wait for the facts before you speak. So often, first reports are wrong. And I know this from experience, having been in the White House and written remarks after so many tragedies and mass shootings and terrorist attacks, that so much information is coming in so quickly at the beginning. And some of it turns out not to be true almost every time. And of course, you don't know that on the first day. So, a good leader, a capable leader, is someone who is patient, who waits for the facts, rather than rushing out and trying to use every tragedy for their own partisan political ends. So it's I wouldn't say it's disappointing, because I personally and half the country don't expect anything different from this man. But it's sad, and it's sad, and it's sad for the victims. But
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. The irony of Trump accusing people of being appointed to positions that they're not suitable for. Meanwhile, he's going through a cabinet hearing process, putting in people like Bobby Kennedy into the Department of Health is not lost on me. Anyway, let's talk about the book. After leaving the job at the White House, you founded Global Voices, in which you've obviously, as you've just mentioned before, helped a lot of executives, students, politicians, people from the philanthropic community. Oh, I struggle on that word. And everyone else in between hone their message and craft it. What compelled you to pull together all of your reflections, your work, your professional life, and put it into a book?
Well, it's interesting. I wasn't planning on it. I know it's pretty common for folks to serve at high levels and come out and write a memoir about everything they did. And I had no interest in that. I had no plans to do anything like that. But two things really. One was, after spending 25, 30 years writing for other people, spending my whole life trying to capture their voice and help them communicate in their voice, I found that when I left the White House and started to try to do some public speaking myself, sometimes I was fine. But other times I really struggled. And one of the reasons I struggled was, like, I had kind of, spent so much time helping other people find their voice, I kind of lost my own. Didn't know what I believed or what I thought or what my space was, how I could contribute to the debate. I was a foreign policy speechwriter, but I don't really consider myself a foreign policy expert, in the sense I'm not an Asia Pacific expert or a Europe expert. I helped the experts help the president communicate in clear, simple language. And then I was finally, a few years after leaving the White House, invited to give a big speech overseas. Someone reached out and said, we'd like to have you give a keynote speech to 300 people. And I almost just hung up the phone. I said that this was sort of my worst nightmare. But then I realized, I was sort of going on almost 50 years old, and I was avoiding this thing that was obviously causing me anxiety and fear. And I thought, you know what, I should do this. I should try to just, worst case, I fail, I flop, I'm overseas. No one back home will ever know. I'll never. But I went through this process. Thank God it wasn't, a speech 2-3 weeks away. It was 6 months away. I had 6 months to get ready. And so I sat down very deliberately and thought, okay, what was Barack Obama doing all those years when he was such an effective public speaker? What was I doing as his speechwriter that was so easy, not, became second nature for me to do for him.
Mm.
How can I do it for myself? What are the basics, and what am I missing? So going through that process, preparing a presentation, then finally actually doing it and having it go well, and having the audience respond to it. It's like, okay, well, I'm thinking there's a lot of people around the world who struggle with communication, public speaking. I think I can share this experience, my own journey to become a better public speaker, and the lessons that I learned from President Obama. And so that's, I started giving these presentations about that, and folks really responded to it. I thought, rather than spend the rest of my life traveling around giving these presentations, maybe I can write a book, and folks can have it in their own hand. And so that's where it came from.
It's two reflections from reading that part. You're talking about the nervousness that you had about going and delivering this speech overseas. The first one was, now for the viewers at home, Terry is very generous with his time. When the Dunn Street United States engagement mission goes over to Washington DC, Terry hosts the delegation for a dinner of a particular evening. And reading the book and you talking about sometimes the nervousness you have about speaking in front of certain groups of people, I'm like going, Terry, I never picked that up at all when you came and spoke. You speak to us every year. It's like one of the best sessions of the program. People love it. And I'm like, there's no indication whatsoever of any nervousness coming from you. So that was such a surprise to read that in the book.
Well, I think it's all about setting too. When I meet with y'all, it's wonderful. Number one, it's a pretty small, intimate group, right? We're sitting around a table. There's maybe a dozen of us or less. So to me, that's very manageable. We're seated. I'm not, we're having a conversation. We're eating. It feels like we're at Thanksgiving dinner, and it feels like we're with family and friends. And of course, we've done this several times now. So I see you. I see a friendly face. I think it's a very different experience to have to stand up in front of a group of people and to be the center of attention, uninterrupted for 10, 15, 20 minutes, where you need to deliver. When you're sitting around at a table, we can pause, we can take a drink, we can ask someone a question, it's more of a conversation. But the idea of standing in front of a group of people and giving a presentation or a speech of some kind for, again, 5, 10, 15 minutes longer, that is a whole different level. That's what I think really, where I struggled, to have to be there and kind of own the room and deliver that message. And I think that's where a lot of people struggle. Again, I think it's, we of course get in our head, and I talk a lot about this, but yeah, I appreciate, I can have a conversation, and I could say I had some great speaking, and some good public speaking experiences, but I also had some very difficult ones that I mentioned in the book. And I think it was that sort of seesaw of, sometimes I'm okay, and other times I'm really struggling here. What's going on? And ultimately it was stick me in a room, sit down, intimate, I'm fine. Stand up, give a speech or presentation. That was where I struggled.
The seesawing that you just mentioned there, one of the things I reflected on when you talked about one of the experiences, I think it might have been your maybe it was your graduation speech. I can't remember what it was, but talking in a big room. I remember as a young union organizer, I was sent to a workplace induction for a brand new supermarket that was getting opened up. There was 400 employees all seated in a massive auditorium, and I was given 20 minutes to speak to these workers and try and recruit them all to the union. And it was like sort of a one shot in the locker opportunity, right?
Yeah.
As opposed to having to go chase them all on the floor of the supermarket to get them to sign their cards. Here was a moment where I could have got them to, and I was very new and young in my union experience. I'd done some inductions previously, but not to that size. And just walking to the lectern, all of a sudden I was overcome with nerves, and then getting to the lectern and then looking at all of these like 400 blank faces staring back at me. And those first words, I could hear through the microphone, my voice reverb back at me, and I could hear how nervous I was. And then it just became this perpetual cycle. It got worse and worse and worse. And in the end, I stuffed it up. Like, I think I probably got no more than 20% of those people signed the union that day. And I walked away so angry at myself. But reading about your experiences like that just made me reflect on those moments as well. And I don't look. We're going to talk about the book, but I don't want to. I want people to read the book because you talk about ways in which you can overcome that. But I just want to get a broad sense from you about What are the conditions that lead you to be in that moment, first of all? But then how do you want to try and overcome that to make sure that you deliver great communication and hit your goal?
So why is this happening in the first place? I don't know. I reached out to a clinical psychologist who specializes in helping people work through phobias and fears, and who's done a lot of work with people in the public speaking space. And she had a very sort of simple yet profound explanation for it, which is that at our core, the worst thing that can happen to us, rooted in our deep ancestry, is to be rejected by the people that we admire and love and care for the most. So our families, our coworkers, our friends, and the idea of getting up in front of them and giving a presentation, a speech, or what have you, that is somehow embarrasses us or brings shame or discredit upon the group, the tribe. This ancient fear that we'll be rejected, cast out to the tribe, that it is so deeply powerful. And I think that's exactly what's going on. I mean, people say, "I don't want to get up." They're not confident. They're going to make a mistake, and they fear what people will think when they make that mistake, and so they don't do it. I mean, it's a pretty simple explanation. What we know, that what's the worst going to happen is you get a little embarrassed. But our DNA, our ancestral roots are telling us, no, actually, you're going to be rejected and cast out to the wolves, and you're all alone. So I mean, there's a lot going on there. I asked President Obama once a question that I had never heard him asked, that I couldn't believe no one had ever asked him, which was, "What do you think makes an effective public speaker?" He's one of the great speakers, whether you like his politics or not. He's one of the, undeniably one of the great communicators of the 20th century and 21st century. And, no one had ever asked him this. So he gave me his answer. And what really surprised me about it wasn't anything about structure, although he cared a great deal about structure, narrative arc, and all that. He wasn't answer about body language, although he's got great body language. He knows how to deliver a line. What he said was, for him, great public speaking comes down to people who know who they are, know what they believe, and speak from a place of core conviction. And I think when you think of all the great speeches you've ever heard, or the great speakers that you admire, they have all those things. And when you think of all the politicians and business leaders who have flailed and who seem hollow and empty, who don't seem to know who they are or what they believe, it's because of that. They say one thing on Monday to one group, they send something different to another group on Tuesday, because they don't know who they are, they don't know what their core beliefs are, and they're just trying to play to whatever crowd they're in front of. So I think, one of the things that I do early in the book is I give people a series of questions almost more like a therapy session, because before we can go out there, stand up in front of a group of people, again, whether it's in the workplace or a rally or a eulogy or a toast or what have you, in a political setting, if you want other people to believe in you and know what you stand for, then you have to know. You have to do some really deep thinking about why you're there, why you choose to be someone who gets up and speaks, what you stand for, what you believe, and what you're trying to accomplish and get other. So everyone remembers, the first time Barack Obama ever came out and gave a speech to the United States, 2004 Democratic Convention, told the story of who he was and how his story is connected to the story of America. I asked one of his top advisors, David Axelrod, years later about that speech, and he said, "I don't think President Obama could have given that speech if he hadn't spent years of his life thinking deeply about who he was, what his identity was, and how he fit into, as the son of a white woman from Kansas and a black African from Kenya." He had a lot of thinking to do, more so than maybe most of us. But he went through that process. So, he gets there, he's 42 years old, and he has a real deep sense of who he is not. And so he can speak very authentically from a place of conviction. And so that's a lot, but I think the great speakers do that. And if we want to be a great communicator, you have to be able to answer these basic questions. And so it's a process that I went through, and I encourage everybody to do the same.
100% agree. Like anyone who's done the public narrative course with Marshall Gantz at the Kennedy School, the story of self, anyway, he calls public narrative a practice. It's something that we have to continue to practice and work on. And it requires you to, first of all, if you want to communicate your story of self, you need to understand, to your point, who you are and why you care. And that means you have to reflect on the moments in your life that led you to be in this particular room today. And I think a lot of times politicians don't do that. they they skim the surface. They just sort of think, this is enough. I've got Labor values because of my dad was a plumber,
Right.
and
I
that's
had
it.
a client once where, I was going through, this client was a very successful business person. She was invited to give the commencement address at her college. And, commencement addresses are typically, you don't get up and deliver a policy speech. You share something about yourself and share maybe some lessons you've learned in your life and impart some wisdom to the graduates. And so, I was asking her all sorts of questions like this. Well, tell me about your childhood. Tell me about your parents. What was your family like? When did you start developing an interest in business? What were your failures? And at some point she put her hand up. She goes, stop, stop, stop. This feels like a therapy session. This is not what I signed up for. And I said, great. I'm thrilled that you feel that way, because that's exactly how it should feel. Because again, if you're going to get up in front of all these young people who are about to embark on their life and make use of that 10 to 15 minutes that you've been given, you ought to know who you are and what you stand and what has shaped you. Because and if you don't, you can't share it. But once you do know it, that becomes the essence of your story.
Well, obviously, this is a political podcast, and your background was in politics. But I'm wondering who you had in mind in terms of the reader when you wanted to make these points. It's probably wider than politicians, right? It can be something that can be adopted in any framework.
Oh, absolutely. I did not write this book I wrote this book for everybody. I know. And so I wrote this book. This is a book for anybody, anywhere, whoever has to get up in front of a group of people and communicate. It's also, I think this book will help you write emails better. I think it'll, help you have phone conversations better conversations with your family. But really, it's for anybody. It's for the veteran CEO who's been running a company for years and wants to become a better leader, better communicator. It's for folks running for office. It's folks who've already hold office. It's for young advocates and activists who are trying to mobilize people, like you said, that moment in the grocery store. Because, whatever path you choose, you have to be able to connect with people. You have to be able to inspire people, motivate them. And, again, we're surrounded. To be honest with you, I think the irony is that most of the speeches many of us hear are from politicians. Day in, day out. And yet I think as a general rule, politicians are pretty bad public speakers. They engage in a lot of the tactics and techniques that I think actually drive people apart and create divisions and foster animosity. And this whole book is about using your words, your language to try to, bring people together for good, not effective rhetoric to mobilize people to hate other people. So yeah, it's for everybody.
In your professional capacity, when you're talking to folks and want to support them in speech writing or public communication, do you find that people often play down their ability to change or embrace public speaking? Like, do you find people who say, I'll never be good at public speaking, this sort of closed mindset?
Right. Yeah, or I have people come. Usually they come to me because they're trying to get better in some way. Maybe they're awful and they need to be serviceable, or maybe they're fine and they want to get better. But yeah, the opening statement is obviously I am not a very good public speaker, or a statement that seems very permanent, right? But one of the big lessons of the book is that public speaking, like anything, is a skill. It's a skill that anyone can learn, anyone can practice, and anyone can get better at. And so I tell the story in the book. We all remember Barack Obama for when he was that famous speech comes out 2004. He sounds perfect. He's also a 42-year-old man, and he's been giving speeches for years. So when you see someone like that, any athlete, musician, whatever, they're at the top of their game. You're seeing the finished product. You're seeing the result of years and years and decades of work. He told me a story once that I include in the book about a time when he was in his mid-20s as a young community organizer in Chicago, giving a lot of speeches, got to be pretty good at it, got a little cocky one day, didn't practice, didn't prepare, didn't write it down. And what do you think happened? It was a disaster. He froze. He lost his train of thought. He started sweating and stammering. It was bad, and he was embarrassed. So anyone tells you that anyone's a naturally gifted speaker, don't believe it. He had to work. He had to go from that young 20-year-old who struggled that day to someone who could give a speech that is considered one of the speech for the ages. And he walked me through all the different ways he got better, very deliberately trying to improve that skill. And I share that in the book, and I want people to know that, and especially young people. If you look at 42-year-old, 50-year-old Barack Obama and think, well, I'll never be that. Well, he wasn't that either. He was you when you were in your 20s and your 30s, and he had to work to get better too. He was still working to get better even as president. I share stories in the book where he talks about his own, he's a masterful orator, but he still struggled at times as a speaker and as a communicator, even as president. We touch on that in the book as well.
Let's go there for a quick second. What were the conditions, or was it a particular type of topic or area that, or was it a setting? When was it that the president found that to be a challenge?
I think it was mostly, he would in prepared speeches where he had put in the work, or we had worked with him. He was very concise and very powerful. I think the area, and he says this himself in the book, press conference, open-ended settings where, he's asked a question at a press conference, and, sort of the old constitutional law professor instincts kicked in. And, he didn't want to just answer the question and give a soundbite, to his credit, to the media. He wanted to help unpack the problem. And so he might sort of, say, well, let's go back to the beginning and how this all started, and, after Reconstruction in the United States, after the Civil War, and then, 5-10 minutes in, you're only up to the mid 60s. So, and I'm exaggerating, but, it's funny. I tell a story in the book where, he knew that he struggled to be concise in those moments, in that and debates. So same thing, right? You get asked a question, you have a limited amount of time. And, he thought debates, the way they're constructed here in the United States, were just artificial and absurd. Hey, what's your answer to race in 90 seconds? I mean, there is no answer to race or to the economy in 90 seconds, and yet you're supposed to give one. Which he just rejected the whole premise that was a fair way to conduct a search for a president. So he struggled at press conferences, he struggled at debates, but it's something he did work at. He was trying to be more concise. But yeah, so that's something that, again, that in his particular case, he said that would always be he knew that we were behind the scenes sort of banging our heads into the desk saying, no, stop, don't go back to Reconstruction. just give the answer that they're going to show in the evening news. But, he said I know you all wanted me to be more concise. I know you wanted sound bites, but, these are complicated issues, and I think they deserve thoughtful answers. And he said, I put this in the book, he said, if it took some more words and it wasn't always the most elegant way to communicate, I was willing to do that because I felt it was important to speak the truth and to deal with nuance and complexity. So yeah, tension there, right? He was acknowledging that it wasn't probably the best way to communicate in a political soundbite world, but it was the truth, and that's where he wanted to be.
Bill Simmons, who obviously you'll know a lot, maybe a lot of our audience here in Australia won't, sort of a sports podcaster, media guy, interviewed the president, I think when he was still president, actually. And then after the podcast, he reflected on the conversation because he had only been given like 40 minutes or something with President Obama. And he had so many questions to ask him, all sports related. But he was going through his list of questions he wanted to do, keeping an eye on the time. And Obama was so deliberate in his answers and was reflective, and there was big pauses. And Simmons is saying, oh my God, he's burning the shot clock. Like, I'm running out of time to get all my questions through. And he thought it was a tactic. He was not accusatorial towards the president, but he was kind of saying, like, this guy is just very good at slowing the game down. But to your point, maybe it was more actually just sort of he's far more reflective as a communicator.
Really like thinking through a problem. Like, you're asking me a question about a particular issue today, maybe an economic issue. Well, the issue does not exist in a vacuum. It exists because of choices and policies made over many years, many decades, perhaps centuries. And so he wanted to help, before he gives the answer, he wants to help diagnose the problem. And sometimes that could get a little verbose, but
yeah. You talked about truth just before in your answer as well. And I think the book sort of transcends speechwriting and public speaking in some other ways. You do touch on this sort of warning of demagoguery, your emphasis on factual accuracy and telling the truth. And I just want to get a sense from you about how do we tell who the good leaders are from the manipulative ones?
Yeah, I think one of the reasons I have a whole section of the book called "Don't Be a Demagogue," and here are all the things that demagogues do, and it's an appeal to my readers to not do them. Don't do these things. And just because certain leaders do it all the time, every day, doesn't mean we should. Doesn't mean we should embrace that. And it's tempting because I think, I got this question recently. Well, Donald Trump won. He won the election. He got more votes than his opponent. So his way clearly works. My answer to that is, well, obviously he won the election, but so didn't Barack Obama twice. So didn't Joe Biden once, with a very different approach to rhetoric and to communication, and I think a bit more belief in the importance of facts. So yeah, every time we get up to speak, whether in our families, our church, our neighborhoods, our workplaces, our communities, at a convention, we have a choice to make as individuals. We can be the thing we detest, or we can try to be better. We can try to do it a different way. And this book is an appeal to people to speak with civility, to speak with empathy, to speak with honesty, to speak the way we would want to be heard and seen with our children watching us. Now, we have a very different leader in the United States right now. And throughout history, demagogues and tyrants and dictators have obviously communicated in a different way. And at times they win power. But that doesn't mean we should emulate that. So that's the idea behind that portion of the book.
When we think about a word that reflects the Obama presidency, the word is hope for me, and obviously it was on that famous poster which adorns my living room. And I think about the word that sort of symbolizes the Trump presidency, and I think it's hate. And so we on the left would look at Obama and say he was a uniting figure, and we look at Trump on the right and suggest that he's not. But I do wonder sometimes, if you are someone who's going to those Trump rallies, you probably do think he's uniting the country. Is there ways in which we on the left are missing? Like, what am I trying to say? You can deliver a speech in a certain way, and you only hear the things that you want to hear.
Sure. Yeah, I don't know whether you or how many of your listeners, had a chance to actually listen to the Trump's inaugural address. I thought it was one of the most partisan, divisive inaugurals perhaps in American history. His supporters loved it, and they say, well, and I did a post on it on LinkedIn, and someone said, why are you trying to turn a moment of hope and unity into some partisan attack? And I'm thinking, clearly we live on different planets, which is part of the problem. But you said if you had to boil it down to one word, hate. I wouldn't necessarily disagree with you that. The first word that came to my mind was anger. And it's and if you've ever watched a Trump rally, it's just one villain after another. It's the corrupt political establishment who's against you and exports your jobs. It's the radical leftist elite who look down upon you. It is the on and on and on and on, enemy after enemy, and it's so much of it is rooted in fear, and some of those fears, listen, are legitimate, right? Like when a country loses millions upon millions and millions of manufacturing jobs over many years across administrations of both parties. Yeah, if you live in one of the communities where you've seen your working industrial base just be absolutely devastated, you're probably angry. And you have a right to be angry because something went wrong. And then, listen, we did have a situation here where in the first 2 years of the Biden administration, they lost control of the southern border. That is a fact. That's not a political statement. When millions of people come across your border in an unregulated way, I remember seeing those images and I'm thinking, this is going to be a political catastrophe. People, either your countries have borders or they don't, and millions of Americans saw that, and they did not like what they saw, and so they were angry, and in many cases, yes, that did turn into hate. Has turned into hate of other groups of people. But yeah, to me, it's anger, and I think one of the challenges that Kamala Harris had is, in a time when people are angry at the system, they think the system is rigged. is stacked against them. They can't get a fair shake. And you campaign, I mean, and you're the incumbent party and you're campaigning on joy, that's a hard sell. And I don't, I'm not, I think that she was trying to obviously draw a contrast between the anger and the hate of Donald Trump. Um, but do you ask yourself who is speaking more to the mood of the country? Americans, like a lot of places around the world, right? I mean, just about every incumbent party has either been thrown out of office or lost vote share in the last few years. I mean, people everywhere, I mean, they're fed up with high prices. They're fed up with the cost of living. They can't afford to, the groceries and gas and education and housing. I mean, people are angry, and along comes someone who says, "Well, I'm angry too. We're gonna screw the system that screwed you." I get why millions of people resonates with people, and I think those of us on the left, if all we do is ever say, "Well, that person's a disgusting bigot," they're not worthy of the office. I mean, we've tried that argument for over nearly a decade. It didn't work. So every time I hear someone say, "Oh, isn't he awful? Isn't he terrible? Isn't he so disgusting?" I have no patience for that. That folks are angry about issues, show them that you have a better answer to their problem.
It was something that I found interesting during the campaign itself, and I think we may have touched on it in previous podcasts, and I just want to get your reflection on it. But is the substance in American political communication? But I'll go to an example in a moment, but actually I want to ask you a more broader question first of all. Do you see much variation in public political communication and speech writing by political leaders across the English-speaking world? Like, do you think that there's a type of tone that is a very American type political speech delivery versus the UK or Canada or Australia, New Zealand?
Yeah, one of the when I do workshops in different places, this comes up a lot. A big part of American political rhetoric is, getting really personal and vulnerable and opening up and telling your story. It's Abe Lincoln born in a log cabin, show that you're of the people and really, weave your personal narrative into the moment. And so we always think of here as, the great political leaders, they have a message that matches the moment and they have a biography that matches the message. And so that's why you hear so often, I mean, a lot of foreigners think, why, Kamala Harris gets up and talks about what it was like to have her mom, working so hard so they could afford their first home. She remembers what that was like. And, it's not that other countries don't do this, but particularly in like, continental Europe, I get this pushback all the time. It's like, "Oh, well, in France, we don't do that. In Germany, we don't do that. In Italy, but I think that's probably the biggest thing that I've noticed and the biggest pushback. So much of what my book is about is how to bring yourself and bring your story and all these unique experiences you had to front and center when you speak and when you communicate, because that's, as human beings, that's what we connect to. We connect to stories, we connect to other human beings. And I get the pushback all the time. So I go, "Well, my German boss, the CEO, doesn't really want to do that. He wants to just talk about the product and the services." And I think, "Well, how are those speeches going?" And I say, "Well, they're kind of boring." So it's like, "Well, here's one way you could personalize it." But I know, this, and there's in every country there's a reason. I did have a German speechwriter tell me once, "Well, in our country we've had some not so great experiences with leaders who are too charismatic." So we've learned the dangers of that sort of an approach. It's a fair point. We're learning, I think. What's interesting is that Donald Trump does not do that. He does it in certain ways, but not others. You almost, he'll tell you stories all the time of, what he heard from another business leader, what he said, he was somewhere, what he saw. He'll do that very good. He almost never, ever discusses his childhood, his family, his parents, his upbringing, which is a huge red flag. Obviously, I'm not a psychologist, but someone who never, ever, ever lets us into that space, to me, is someone who is profoundly uncomfortable with that part of his life. There's something, about that experience. I mean, he boasts about everything. He never talks about that. So, there's clearly something going on there. But yeah, I think that's probably one of the biggest differences that I see.
And the reason why I ask that is because, when think about, so for example, the Democratic National Convention last year, and I watched most days, and a lot of the speeches were reminded me, actually, I won't say they were good, but I'll say that they reminded me of how American public speakers and politicians are very comfortable about talking about their story, talking about moments, bringing moments into the narrative, which is so absent in Australian public speaking
Mhm.
in the political class. But then when it got to the campaign proper, and I was over there in Detroit and watching the rallies, it still stayed what I would say up in the rarefied value frame, like the big picture stuff, and didn't get down to what I would call the nitty gritty, meaningful benefits. Here specifically is how I'm going to make your life better. I went into ChatGTP and I grabbed the Gettysburg Address and I said, change this as if this was delivered by a modern Australian politician. And it was quite funny because it was a bit there where in the Gettysburg Address it says it is for us the living rather to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which they who fought here have thus far so nobly advanced. And the Australian version is, we owe it to them to keep going. And that means real action on a fair go for working Australians, cost of living relief, and a stronger healthcare for all. But, it even goes further because we'll increase wages and ensure job security and put an end to labour exploitation. Now, what I thought was absent from the political conversation was the fact that politicians in America don't seem to want to get into the weeds and say, here's specifically how I'm going to fix this problem for you. And do you find that absent in public communication and political campaigns in the United States?
Well, I think it depends candidate to candidate. We've had candidates over the years who, put out dozens of white papers,
That's true.
and I've got a plan for that, and then they list off their 5-point plan. They have a plan for everything. It always becomes kind of a joke, and eh, pundits like it, politicos like it. Most Americans don't read those things, and so no one can tell you what the 5-point plan is. It's like with everything. You don't want to lose the music. You want poetry and prose. I think take Donald Trump for an example. Everybody in the United States knows what his immigration policy is, quote unquote policy that he ran on, right? So until he runs during the campaign, what's he going to do? Whether you love the guy or hate the guy, what is he going to do? He's going to stop the invasion. He's going to build a wall. He's going to do the biggest, deportation in American history. And I'm sure there was other stuff too, but every American could have told you that because he said it over and over and over again. And that's like three things. So I think most of the time that's what people want. They want to know that the leader, is going to prioritize the thing that I care about. Back to what we were talking about a moment ago. If the border and immigration were important to you, then you are going to go with the person who's screaming about it every single day. You're mad, they're going to do a bunch of things. You don't need 10 points. You just need to know they are going to do the thing that I want. So like there was tremendous pressure on Kamala Harris as she was sort of thrust into the top of the ticket. What's your 6 points to reduce costs? What are your 6 steps? Nobody was asking Donald Trump to do that.
No.
No one can even answer the question. What are the 6 things Donald Trump's going to do to lower costs? We're now 2 weeks into his presidency, and he has done hundreds of executive orders. Supposedly got elected to reduce costs. Hasn't done a thing, any meaningful step at all, to show that reducing costs and price of living is his priority. So, I think at the presidential level, governor, mayor, senator, I think the most important thing is to show that you get the people, you understand what you're channeling, their mood, their anger, their priorities, and that this is going to their passions are going to be your purpose, and it's going to be your priority. And if they believe that, if they get that sense, then they'll sure you can have your 10-point plan, but they're not going to read it, and they're not going to be able to remember it.
And so do you think then to that point that even amongst Trump, even when Trump, gives his less disciplined, random thoughts, meandering diatribes, particularly at his rallies, that he still was making that connection with his audience and that they were very clear about what he stood for that he understood the pain they were going through, and therefore there was the connection there.
Absolutely, and not just like their economic pain, because he doesn't really understand that at all. He can't even famously said after the election, I heard this new word during the campaign trail: groceries. Who's ever heard of this word, groceries? It's like when you go to the store and you buy food, groceries. I mean that. So groceries. He'd never heard the word before because the guy's probably never been to the supermarket. He's never done his own shopping. He has no idea what normal people go through in this country. But he basically, like, I will be your giant middle finger to the elite establishment. I will fight for you, and 77 million Americans bought it. So yeah, among his supporters, absolutely right. I mean, there's no doubt. I mean, that's not a critique of it. It's just a fact. Like, yeah, go to a rally, listen to his. They believe he is fighting for them against the system every single day, which is why he picks fights every single day. Because if he's not fighting, then he's not fighting for you. So every day that he's in a conflict, every day that he sticks it to the media or the DC establishment is a great day for Donald Trump. It feeds his narrative.
What did you make of the Right Reverend Mariann Budde, who was the bishop at the National Cathedral in Washington, D.C., her remarks to President Trump on the day of the inauguration? She stared him down, a gutsy kind of speech.
Yes, there he is at a service, standard traditional. He's got to sit there in the front row, and the bishop, and she decides to make an appeal to appeal to a sense of mercy and compassion and empathy. Obviously, an act of remarkable courage to do that. I'm sure that a lot of people that she knew were asking her what, if anything, she would say, and I'm sure she would have felt that she had sort of not risen to the moment. I have sort of mixed thoughts on it, and I haven't really talked about too much. But I think she's on the right side of history. She's standing up for those who are vulnerable and in fear. I think the question that we all have to ask whenever we want to deliver tough messages to people is, what is the right way to deliver this tough message to this person? And we know from, again, nearly a decade of watching Donald Trump, that when he feels threatened or he feels put upon, he gets his back up. And so my question is sort of, what's the right way? Like, what's the right way to, if your goal is to appeal to Donald Trump and to somehow get in his head, and if there is a sliver of empathy and compassion left in this man, how do you get to it? I don't know if the public lecture of him, which is the way I think it came off to a lot of people, I'm not sure I would have counseled it to do it exactly that way. The moment she said, "Mr. President," he probably felt he was being lectured to, and he's just not going to take it. Whereas another approach, perhaps, might be, as we all know how this guy's brain works, you play to his, how he sees what is a strong leader? You could frame the whole thing around strength, and we know he loves William McKinley, the President McKinley. I'm sure McKinley did something compassionate and empathetic towards people. Talk about that. Think of all the people that Donald Trump admires, that he strives to be like and compared to, and talk about how they've shown empathy. There's different ways to do it, but I tremendous act of political courage. Thank God she did it. Someone has to be speaking up for mercy and and empathy. That's why I wrote the book. I'm thrilled that she did it, and she's getting a lot of blowback for it.
Which, I mean, that's half the thing, isn't it? In her mind, as she was preparing her notes, it wasn't just the nervousness of actually delivering that sermon to the President of the United States, but also then the aftermath of it when the right-wing media come for you as well. It's just a whole different kettle of fish. I want to ask you a question about AI. You sort of touched on it a little bit in the book, and I made a joke before about using ChatGPT to do some work for me about making an Australian version of the Gettysburg Address. But in all seriousness, like, what role does AI have? Are you comfortable with this platform or this tool in the craft of speech writing.
Yeah. So it's interesting. I started writing the book in 2021, at 2020, 2021. And then, right in the middle of it, out comes this thing called ChatGPT. It blows everybody's mind. And I'm thinking, okay, all right, well, this is gonna change things. So throughout the book, I have these little asides, sort of when to ask a bot, when not to ask a bot. And I think because there's things we should be very worried about, and ways that can help us. To me, it kind of comes down to two things. It's an incredible research tool, right? It's an incredible brainstorming partner. If you're struggling to come up with a topic or a theme for a speech, you can, ask it. I am a student. I have to give a commencement speech. Give me 10 topics. The kind of thing you might ask your colleague at work or your family member. Find me 10 quotes. Give me a structure. Draft the speech. But so as a research partner, phenomenal, incredible, saved countless hours. I mean, and it's only gonna get better. It's just, of course, if it gives you 10 quotes, you got to check it's not making up quotes.
Yeah.
But when the moment comes and you are a human being standing up in front of other human beings, and they want a human connection with you, I think the worst thing you can do is read a script written by a machine, by a bot, right? Eulogies, toasts, work presentations, political rallies. Again, people have come together to hear you, another human being. And everything we've been talking about here today about the importance of sharing your story and your experiences, and bringing your own unique life to bear and your values. There's no machine that's going to know all that stuff. I mean, unless you input it, and at that point you're writing the speech. You're telling it all the things about you and just organizing it. So people want to know what's in our heart, and the machines aren't going to know that unless we tell them. So, I just believe that our voice, our story, is the most powerful thing we have in the world, and we should never give it over to a bot.
It's also not funny. I've tried to get ChatGPT to write gags for me, and they're shit. I'll just put that out there as well. So if it's not emotional, it's not funny either. Speaking of funny, obviously you mentioned in the book a whole bunch of really famous speeches that Obama gave, many of which you wrote. I'm actually interested in one particular one, which was at the Washington Correspondents' Dinner, where he got up and gave a speech, and Michael Kay came up and stood behind him as his anger translator. Do you recall that? Do you know the background to that? Like, because that's kind of risky, really, that they did that. But they both nailed it.
Yeah, I mean, I was not the lead speechwriter on that speech, or actually on any of those. They call it the White House Correspondents' Dinner. We had one or two speechwriters who really specialized in the humor and the jokes. They decided that me, as a foreign policy speechwriter, that I was decidedly not funny, which I did absolutely disagree with them. I would tell them I'm very funny, and they would say you're not. So anyway, there you go.
Well, that's a good gag there, right there, Terry.
There you go. Right. But that was, he was going to be Luther, the anger, management translator, and they worked on it together. It was phenomenal. I mean, one of I think one of the best ones that the folks remember. But and in fact, actually, that brings up a good point, because I think one of the things that when people come to me to work with me, one of the first things they say, "Oh my God, I need a joke. I need to start with a joke." And my first answer is, no, you don't. You don't need a joke. You're not a late night TV host. You're not a stand up comedian. No one wants you to be. And it's that you start trying to do these canned jokes. You sound like you're some comic from the 1950s. The best thing you can do is just use humor, right? And there's a difference between jokes and humor. Humor is just shared connections, things that you share, unexpected references. We can all do that. We do that all the time. We do it with our colleagues. We do it with our family. So I have a whole section of the book about how to use humor that isn't necessarily telling a joke.
How do you? The opposite of that is that sometimes you might want to share something that is quite emotive and moving for you, you want to convey vulnerability, but perhaps you've not got closure on it yourself, and actually in the moment when you are starting to share it, all of a sudden the voice starts to crack, and you realize, shouldn't have brought this one up. Still a little bit emotional about this.
Yeah. I mean, again, I think there's a, every once in a while there's a speech that goes viral, someone in the country, not usually a politician, and oftentimes it's because they're emotional, because they're being honest and open and authentic with what they feel. And again, to me, that's another great, a great metric. Almost always I think, was it Steve Kerr, the coach, after one
Yeah.
of our mass shootings in the United States, turned his post game press conference into just a real passionate appeal for common sense gun reform, and it went absolutely viral. Why? Well, he was deeply, deeply emotional. And when I teach speech writing to students at the university level, I encourage them to write speeches that are deeply emotional. And yeah, there have been a number of times where students have had to collect themselves. They're tearing up, their voice is quivering, they're shaking in front of their classmates. Uh, they're almost always the speeches that the other students admire the most. So I talk a lot about in the book about not being afraid to be open and vulnerable, and to when appropriate, when appropriate, to share the things that we're all so eager to share our triumphs and our successes. Well, share your failures, share your setbacks, share the things that have caused you pain, because guess what? Just about probably everybody in that audience has had that same pain at some point. We tend to, and it can be incredibly powerful and healing for other people to know that they're not alone. So, I have never heard of an audience that said, "Man, I just wish that person hadn't gotten so personal and emotional."
Mm.
It's the opposite. At least here in the United States, that's how it is.
But 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 yet, Terry, and I'm interested in your thoughts on this. People are so reluctant to do that, though.
Oh yeah, because it's scary and it's vulnerable, right? It's real. I tell a story in the book. It's full of stories of just ordinary folk. It's not just me and Obama. What I learned from Obama. There's filled with stories from just ordinary folks all over the country and around the world. I tell this one story of this 13-year-old girl in Arizona. She had to, her English class, she had to stand up and recite a poem or give a poem. So she did. She wrote her poem, and she wrote about how she was struggling with body dysmorphia and eating disorder and being bullied. And she's going to deliver this poem in front of her class, the very people that are bullying her. I mean, this is unbelievable, right? Think of the
Mm.
courage that it took for her to do that. She does this, and by the time she's done, the whole class is in tears, and everyone's coming up to her, including some of the people who have been bullying her, and saying, "I feel the same way." What? That everybody in one way or another was insecure about something.
Mm.
They were being teased about something. They were being harassed. Her speech went viral. People all over the world wrote to her, sparked a big national conversation in this country about the issues facing teenagers, especially teenage girls, all because this one kid had the courage to get up and be vulnerable and say things that they thought only they were feeling. It turns out everybody was feeling it. So wise for age. She said she is so glad that she did it because it not only helped her, but that it helped other people, that it helped the people who were hurting her. One of the most effective and powerful things you can do is open up and share these pieces of yourself. It's one way to do it.
Tell us the story of the speaking about making a connection with other peoples. The president visited our wonderful shores many years ago. Tell us the story of the Aussie.
Oh, sure. I said so. We came to Australia twice with President Obama. It was two of my favorite trips. And the first one, we went out to Darwin, and he was going to give a speech to several thousand U.S. and Australian troops. The Prime Minister Gillard sitting right next to him, and we had the speech all written. It was pretty much done, 99%, but it didn't really have an opening. And all good speeches should have a good opening, something that really grabs the audience, something unexpected, something to surprise them. And I didn't have it. It was just kind of an beginning. So I'm sitting there in the motorcade, just kind of running out of ideas, and I just turned to the Australian guy driving our van, and said, "Hey, I'm a speechwriter for the president. He's giving this speech. Is there any good way to greet a bunch of Australians?" And he goes, "Oh, that's easy, mate." And he says, "Oh, you should just say Aussie, Aussie, Aussie." And I'm like, I don't, okay. And then what? And he's like, "Well, then they're all going to say, oi, oi, oi." And I said, "Oh, all right, well, I'm an American. Number one, I don't know what that means. Uh, he said, well, what does it mean? He said, well, I said, well, what's the translation? He said, well, it doesn't really translate. It's like a cheer. I said, yeah, but what's the American word? He said, well, I don't know. I don't. I said, well, I'm not going to. I can't just give him this phrase and not know. I mean, I don't know if it's some like fringe extremists wink and nod to some, I don't know what it is. And I said, well, what if they don't say oi, oi, oi? And he said, trust me, mate, they will. And I said, but what if they don't? It'll be really embarrassing and cause an incident. He's like, trust me, they will. So I, all right, why not? So we put it in, we checked with a few people. They're like, yeah, sure, why not? And he comes out, he does this. He says, hey, I hear you've all got a great, Australian saying. And he says it, and just everybody just on cue, just screams out oi, oi, oi. And it would, he's smiling, the prime minister's smiling, everyone's clapping and cheering. Not the most sophisticated, I can't say there's some speech writing technique, but one of the lessons that I still don't know what oi, oi, oi means. Maybe you can tell me. But there was no diplomatic incident. But the reason I share in the book is because not only is it important to like try to do something interesting up front, but when you're preparing a presentation or whatever you do for a living, don't just ask the people around you. I had asked all of our colleagues at the White House. I had asked our colleagues in the Australian government. No one came up with that. And I thought to ask a van driver, and he came in. So you're writing a eulogy for your beloved grandmother. Of course, talk to all your family and your friends, but maybe go talk to her neighbor who saw her every day, or the folks at the grocery store who saw her every day. They probably have some really cool, interesting takes on this person that you loved. And just sort of be creative, reach out, look everywhere, ask everyone for ideas. Had we not done that, so there's a there's a guy out there. Maybe he lives in Darwin. I don't know. Maybe he'll be listening to this. You helped write a presidential speech, and it was a lot of fun.
Well, last couple of questions just before we wrap up. Interested to get a sense of public speaking or speeches that have transcended into film or television. Are there any ones that you look back at? I know that they're all being created by, a bunch of artists and writers, but I think about sort of Al Pacino on Any Given Sunday or something like that. Is there any that stand out for you that were like, oh, that's actually pretty good? I wish I wrote that speech.
Yeah. So so many people love The West Wing, President Bartlett, right? There's a famous scene in The West Wing where some reporter from like sort of like a right wing outlet challenges him as someone supposedly, I'm going to paraphrase it, Mr. President, supposedly you're a person of faith who believes in the Bible. How can you support homosexuality and gay rights? And he, of course, it's a script, so it's all lined up. It's just one thing after another. He just sort of picks, rips into her for this selective reading of the Bible and shows that, number one, he's quite knowledgeable of the Bible, and he lists off 10 things that the Bible says that we would never do today, right? Stoning your wife, all these terrible things, stoning your children, and it's beautiful, and it's putting somebody in their place, and it's a pretty cool. I wish I had, we had versions of that we tried to do in other ways, but that's a pretty cool moment from a fake president.
From a fake president who's a big Notre Dame fan, and that's the only reason I like the show. So we're giving away 2 copies of Terry's book. Where's the camera? Say it. Well, there you go. Look, it's in the beautiful looking cover there. To either one of our Patreon subscribers, or you can subscribe to Patreon and also then get a copy of the book. But it's the first 2 people that write in the Patreon channel, "Go Red Sox," and we will ship it out to you. We'll ship a copy out to you. It's a fantastic book. Unfortunately, it's not going to be have the author's insignia in it, unlike my copy. Very happy about that. Thank you, Terry. But maybe I'll write in it, say, "Terry wish he could have wrote in this for you," from Stephen. But we'll send out 2 copies. So just go to Patreon, go to the Socially Democratic Patreon page, sign up, or if you're currently a subscriber and you want a copy of the book, the first 2 people who write in the message channels, "Go Red Sox," we will send out a copy. You are a native New Englander, Terry, so I'm going to ask you a quick question about New England sports.
Sure.
Obviously, the Celtics won a championship last year. Very happy about that. Made my year. Who do you think is, out of the 4 men's teams in New England, Sox, Bruins, Pats, Celtics, who's most likely to win the next championship, and who's less likely? Who's the furthest away right now from winning a championship?
Are you trying to like get me in trouble with my friends and family back home? I mean, this. Yes, you are. Oh man, I don't even know. I'm embarrassed. I don't know. Maybe most likely, can it be? Hey, go Red Sox! Do I get a copy of the book?
No, you're gonna be on the Patreon page.
That's right. Okay, got to do it on the page. Least likely. Oh man, I don't know. My brother-in-law is a huge Boston Bruins fan, so he's not going to like this. I don't know. Maybe least likely is Bruins. Sorry, Ben.
I think it's a toss-up right now between the Pats and the Bruins. For my mind, I'm worried. I'm worried about the Pats. I really am. But
I'm impressed that you follow it so closely.
What else am I going to do with my day? I mean, really, I just, I pretend that I have a podcast and a consultancy, but ultimately I'm just watching US sports every single day. That's what I do. Terry Szuplat, thank you so much for your time today. Thank you for writing this incredible book. Thank you for sharing your insights on today's podcast. Please, we'll also drop links into the show notes for today's episode where you can buy Terry's book. Get it. Even like obviously most people who listen to the show are involved in politics in some way. It's incredibly relevant for you in that respect. But even if you are not in politics and you're doing other forms of public leadership, you should read this book. It's not just a book that helps you frame good public speaking, but also it's actually a really interesting read because there's a lot of great stories in there as well along that journey. So I just really implore you to get out there. Terry, thanks so much for coming on the show. We wish you the best of luck with 2025, and I look forward to seeing you at the Rasika Indian restaurant in October later this year with the Dunn Street delegation.
I can't wait. It's a highlight of the year. I appreciate it. Thanks so much for having me on, and I hope everyone enjoys the book.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Socially Democratic. Like the podcast? Hit the follow or subscribe button and be sure to leave a review on Apple Podcast or Podchaser and get all the latest updates on Socially Democratic by following us on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, Blue Sky, and LinkedIn. See you next Friday. Thanks for listening to another episode of Socially Democratic. You like the podcast? Then hit the follow or subscribe button and be sure to leave a review on Apple Podcast or Podchaser and get all the latest updates on Socially Democratic by following us on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, Blue Sky, and LinkedIn. See you next Friday.